Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie, and today I'm here with Chris Heighes and Wayne Armstrong, who are both senior consultants with us at URM with many, many years of experience. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today we're going to be talking about overall business approach to risk and risk management. So my first question for you guys to discuss is, many organizations claim to be risk-based in their security approach. What would you say good risk-based decision-making actually looks like in practice, and where does it most commonly break down?
I think the first thing to mention is that organizations might tend to look more towards what they can do to implement controls and look for where their IT is weak and what all the threats are that are being discussed out there in the big wide world, and start implementing things without actually understanding whether those things are required. There is a place for that, because there are some controls that are obvious that you don't need risk management for to determine whether or not they're required. So if you are operating on Windows and you're exposed to the internet, then you're going to have some kind of antivirus in place. It just makes common sense. But I think the thing that a lot of organizations might miss is that they need to understand what it is they're trying to protect in the first place. So what are the business objectives? What are they trying to achieve? What are the most important information assets, for example, that they want to protect and guard against compromise? And determine if those things were compromised, what kind of impact would that cause for the organization? How much would it hurt? And then by doing that, you can concentrate your efforts on protecting those assets in the most appropriate way, and that's where you put your resources, rather than a blanket approach across the organisation.
I think a good example of that is one of the new controls that came in with ISO 27001:2022, the data leakage prevention control. I think when this was first mooted, a lot of organizations immediately assumed that means we need to get a DLP tool in place. And still, quite often when we go into organizations to do audits or to do risk assessments, when we get to the point of talking about this particular control, data leakage prevention, people straight away say, oh, we're quite weak in there. We've got to do work in this space. We haven't really got any tools currently. And you always want to take a step back and say, well, for this control, what is your risk? What are you actually looking to protect? If you're an organisation that isn't handling very much PII, personal information, you don't have a lot of business sensitive information in place, you need to be looking and understanding, well, what data leakages could occur and what would the actual impact of those be. So rather than, as Wayne was saying, rather than immediately bolting for sort of the technical solution that's going to be all singing and all dancing, you need to look and you need to understand what business risk have you actually got there? What are you actually looking to protect? And also, importantly, understanding what protection you already actually have in place.
So in your experience, what information security risks worry you the most today that are not getting enough attention at the board or executive level?
I mean, this is not going to be a surprising answer to anybody, but if we're talking about today, inevitably AI has to be mentioned in this space. We've, over the last couple of years, moved away from organizations looking at AI as this scary thing that essentially they don't really want to have too much to do with, to a situation where they've clearly recognized that it can offer all sorts of business benefits. And to a certain extent, individuals within organizations have recognized that as well. So that's tended to lead to an awful lot of departments and individuals within organizations working with AI and taking the opportunities of utilizing AI tools without any particularly strong governance or oversight. So the term shadow IT is often used in this space, whereby organizations don't really understand exactly what AI is out there and what it's being utilized for, and what data is potentially being exposed as well.
Yeah, I think sticking with the AI theme as well is sort of looking at the threats that are out there where, let's take phishing, for example. So phishing attacks in the past, with the right sort of knowledge and awareness, training for our users, etc., they used to be easy to spot. Spelling mistakes, grammar mistakes, the URLs weren't particularly well disguised, etc. But now, because of AI and the fact that our attackers have access to AI tools, those kinds of attacks are much more sophisticated. And so I think one of the things maybe that's worth thinking about is, yes, you still need to try and prevent those attacks from happening, but also ensure that you think along the lines of, well, at some point, our systems are going to get compromised. Somebody's going to break in. So if they manage to get access, what do they have access to? So limiting your exposure after a data breach. So ensuring that you've got proper access controls, making sure that information is stored in the most appropriate places, making sure it's encrypted, etc. So if an attacker gets in, they don't automatically get access to everything. They have to work harder in order to get access to our information. And hopefully by that time we've detected them and we can throw them out.
Yeah, and then my sort of second point on this is another probably fairly obvious point, but it bears repeating, and it's supply chain management. I still see when going to organizations that even if they have quite strong due diligence processes and risk assessments when they're onboarding new suppliers, there's a concept of once they're onboarded, people can walk away. The risk work has been done. But in actual fact, all the way through the life cycle of a supplier relationship, you need to be keeping an ongoing process in place to assess the level of risk associated with that supplier relationship. For all sorts of reasons, the services that the supplier provides may change, or the way they provide those services may change. The objectives of the organization may change. The level of risk, for whatever reason, in the wider sector marketplace may change as well. So there's the concept that with suppliers, it's not just for Christmas, it's for life. You need to be managing them throughout that whole life cycle.
How do you help organisations move away from checklist-driven compliance and towards meaningful cyber risk management that supports business objectives?
So checklists have their place, and obviously we can't get away from compliance. There are reasons, particularly with, sort of regulated organisations and things like that, where they have to prove that they've got compliant processes in place, etc. I think it kind of links back to the answer to the first question, in that rather than having a checklist that says, has everything got MFA, or are we running backups everywhere, is asking different questions related to business harm if something goes wrong. So instead of asking, do we have MFA anywhere, we should be asking questions around where are the accounts and where is the information that could be harmed if someone gained unauthorized access. And then determining, well, okay, we've identified what those places are. we now need to determine what the most appropriate course of action is. And MFA might be one of those things, but other access controls and levels of authorization, etc., could also be added to the list. So we end up more in a situation where we've got a defense in depth approach to protecting our most important assets, as opposed to just a list of controls that we apply everywhere that may or may not be useful in different circumstances. Another example would be, instead of asking if we've got backups, is asking what would be the impact on an organization if there was a denial of service attack or something like that, and our systems were unavailable. Identifying which of our systems and which of our data are the most important to be available all the time, and then determining the most appropriate course of action, including backups and replication, and testing as well, to ensure that we can recover back to a working state as quickly as possible. So it's about what questions you ask, I think, rather than sort of getting rid of the checklist, etc.
And a key aspect of that is ensuring that you're asking those questions on an ongoing basis. So I think it's that aspect of, with risk management, there needs to be an ongoing engagement with the business. So working with particular departments, with particular subject matter experts on an ongoing basis. The risk team, if an organisation is large enough to have a team that is actually managing risk, that's their role. Their role is to govern and oversee the risk process. It's not to necessarily go out there and identify the specific risks or evaluate the risks. They need to be there to ensure that the risks being captured give a comprehensive profile of the organisation, that there's a consistent process for capturing the risks, and that all of the departments and individuals engaged in the process are being proactive and they're fulfilling their responsibilities. Somebody who's a risk manager, I mean, exactly again as Wayne was saying about the technical controls and the technical products being brought in to sort of mitigate particular threats. The individuals that really understand what the level of risk is and how that risk can potentially be treated are other people on the ground. They're the departments and they're the individuals that are actually working in those spaces. So it's important to do that. And because things change in an organisation and in the world, ensuring that engagement is ongoing. Just because a decision was made to accept a risk 6 months ago, it doesn't necessarily mean that risk should still be accepted now. There could be all sorts of things that could have changed across that period.
I think as part of that as well, there needs to be clear communication. So, like Chris, you're talking about, the people on the ground performing risk assessments, understanding the IT and all of that, and that's not necessarily the role of senior managers, but it's senior managers that hold the budgets. And so the communication piece between the people that are performing the risk assessments needs to be effective when they're talking to leadership, in order for leadership then to make informed decisions around where they're going to spend the money and what the appropriate controls are, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, as you said right at the start of this, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the checklist aspect of risk and risk management, and there needs to be, my favourite term around this, there needs to be a degree of science in the process to ensure that essentially you're comparing apples with apples across the whole business when you're looking at risk and when you're doing risk assessments, and that you've got consistent processes for scoring risks and understanding how different risks compare. But there is absolutely that more artistic aspect of it as well, in terms of you need to be talking to the individuals that understand and know what's going on in the business, so that they can give a clear indication. And it may be for a particular risk, the guys in the platform team are going to say, this is a high level risk based on these particular factors. This risk has to be considered to be a high level risk, even though when you look at the science of your process and you look at your matrices, which determine what's a medium risk, what's a high risk, whatever, it might not match up to that. So it's ensuring that you're making use of your checklist in an appropriate way. You've got that level of science in your process, but also you're taking account of exactly what the business objectives are, what all of the myriad factors are that are involved in helping to determine what the potential impact and likelihood of the risk is.
So with growing dependence on cloud services and third-party providers, how should organisations rethink ownership and accountability for information security risk?
So clearly, we can't kind of rethink accountability itself. Accountability is what it is. It sits at the top. So the board or the CEO are going to be ultimately accountable if something goes wrong, particularly to regulators and other authorities. I think the key is, though, understanding responsibility in a clearer way. So I come across clients when, again, I do risk assessments and internal audits and things like that, just the same way that Chris does. And sometimes you find that different parts of the organization are responsible for different things. But instead of having named individuals that take ownership and responsibility for those things, it will be the responsibility of procurement or supplier management, or it will be the responsibility of IT. But we don't necessarily have named individuals or specifically identified roles. So, for example, the ownership and responsibility for Microsoft and the relationship between the organization and Microsoft and MS365, for example, probably should be the CIO or somebody similar. Responsibility for the payroll provider should go to the finance director, for example. So we have a number of named individuals that can be held, if you want to use that word, can be held internally accountable. So they're accountable to senior management within the organization. They're not accountable for the organization externally, but they're accountable internally. So then we're in a better position then to be able to have appropriate policies in place that are reviewed and approved by appropriate personnel, rather than just saying, oh, that's IT's responsibility or that's procurement's responsibility, etc.
I think, and this comes back to my earlier point, I don't think it's by accident that quite often when you go into organisations, you find that there are quite strong processes for onboarding of suppliers, so the due diligence, those initial risk assessments. And quite often that is because that particular aspect of the process is owned by a very specific team. So it will be owned by a procurement team. It will be owned by the finance, whoever. It will be a very specific team that will have that responsibility, and they will have very specific processes to run through to get to the point of saying, right, we're going to accept that supplier into the organisation. Once a supplier is in the organisation and is delivering its service, again, exactly as Wayne says, essentially the ownership sits with a particular area of business, typically the area of the business that's receiving the service. The challenge I find in this space is that those particular areas that are receiving the service have essentially got day jobs. They are working in IT or they're working in finance or whatever. And the management of their supplier services, the ownership of their supplier services, isn't necessarily number one, number two, or even number three on their list of day job priorities. So it's again, exactly as Wayne says, it's about getting that stronger level of ownership, getting some appropriate processes in place to ensure that everybody understands what their responsibilities are in terms of managing managing suppliers, third-party service providers on an ongoing basis, and making sure that management understand that that's an ongoing responsibility as well, and it needs to be given time on an ongoing basis, fundamentally.
I think as well, Chris, as you probably come across the same thing. As we engage with different clients across different market sectors, etc., we're increasingly coming across organizations that are wholly dependent on cloud services. They don't do anything for themselves. They don't have office space. They don't have networks within an office space or anything like that. They've simply got a laptop connected to the internet, and everything they do is associated with cloud services. Payroll is in the cloud. Networking is in the cloud. Data storage is in the cloud. Everything is in the cloud. And I think one of the tricks that may be missed in some organizations is to understand how those cloud service providers are providing their service. So, for example, if they're all using AWS to host their services and systems, and AWS has an outage, does that mean that all of your suppliers are suddenly going to have an outage and your organization is dead in the water? So there's a bit of a business continuity aspect to that, in understanding if that happened, what would you do? Do you have an alternative place you can go to, or are there different processes that you can put in place to mitigate that if there's a common failure? And we've seen examples of that relatively recently, where organizations such as Cloudflare, for example, have an outage and it affects thousands of organizations. And if some of those thousands are suppliers to you, then it's going to affect you as well.
Yeah, and aligned to that as well. I mean, particularly in larger organizations where you're potentially utilizing a third party to provide a range of services, it's being aware of what that almost like consolidated level of risk is associated with that particular supplier. You could potentially look at, I don't know, the IT team and then the finance team, and they're each using AWS or whatever for particular activities, and they would look at that on an individual basis and talk about a level of risk that's associated with that, without necessarily taking into account the fact that that same supplier or that same service is being utilized maybe in different ways, but across multiple areas of the business. So that in actual fact, if that service isn't available, it's not just impacting you in IT, it's impacting the finance team, it's impacting the product team, whoever out there, possibly in slightly different ways. But there's that concept of not just looking at the individual services being delivered by a particular supplier, but getting an understanding across the organization or even across the group of the level of risk associated with all of the services those particular suppliers are delivering. And I think this is, I mean, I've been working in IT and particularly in consultancy for quite a long time, and it's clear that one of the big changes that has occurred over say the last 10 years has been a general consolidation in terms of the number of suppliers that are out there delivering particular services, whereas I don't know, 8-9 years ago, when you went out and talked to organizations, you would find that they were all utilizing different anti-malware solutions or whatever. Increasingly, all organizations are using a smaller and smaller set of suppliers to be delivering those types of service. And again, as Wayne says, when you look at examples with organizations like CrowdStrike and Cloudflare, the impact that their outages have had been significant because they've got such big footprints across the world, I guess. And again, I think when you get back to individual organisations, it's being clear on exactly what the footprint is across your entire organisation with particular suppliers.
So looking ahead now, sort of 3 to 5 years, what capability or mindset do you think information security leaders must develop now to remain effective risk advisors to the business?
I think one of the key aspects, and I mean saying 3 to 5 years, I think looking at any sort of period into the future, is that basically change happens so quickly. So we were talking earlier about AI. And in truth, you look at the models that organisations have already got in place for governing AI, and they're potentially quite based on the current generation of AI tools. This year has been touted as the year that agentic AI starts to really take a foothold. So you can imagine that there will definitely be a different set of risks associated with the deployment of agentic AI as opposed to the previous generations of AI that have been deployed into organizations, and who's to say how that's going to change in 2027, 2028. So there's absolutely that aspect of it. And also aligned to that, I think it's clear that in the wider world, change happens quicker, and the impact of change happens quicker. So there's the aspect of ensuring that you have risk processes in place that enable you to take account of global events which can bubble up very quickly, and have quite significant impact relatively quickly. I mean, if we look at what's going on with Iran currently, and obviously things like fuel prices and the like, that's come up as an issue relatively quickly, and its impacts have started to hit relatively quickly. And again, who's to say what the next thing is going to be in that space? So the concept of having 6 monthly risk assessment meetings, on some organizations you still have a concept of like an annual risk assessment, doesn't really work in the sort of environment where change is occurring so quickly.
Yeah, and I think as well as being able to respond quickly in an ever-changing environment that's getting more and more faster paced, I do think you also need to keep an eye on.
Sorry, it might just seem faster paced because we're getting older, but
I think you also need to keep another eye on what the next big thing is as well. So on the 3 to 5 year theme, sort of what's going to be coming along in 3 to 5 years, or maybe 10 years, that might alter the way in which we operate. So for the first time ever, when engaging with any client, last week a client asked me if I had any thoughts on quantum computing, and so I kind of only had sort of a basic thought around, well, what sort of impact will that have? We know about the potential capability for quantum computing to unlock all of the good work that we've done with the standard approaches to encryption and things like that we use at the moment. But I do think it's the sort of thing that organizations need to be asking questions about. So, when is quantum computing going to come out of the lab and be more accessible to organizations? When is it likely to be that quantum computing causes a threat to the way our businesses operate? And working back from that, you should have then a good idea of when you need to have your next level of defenses in place in order to combat those kinds of attacks in the future. And there are already approaches that have been approved by the likes of NIST, etc., for organizations to migrate to new ways of operating and new ways of protecting their assets as early as 2028, with a view that things will start happening kind of 2035, that kind of thing. So I think organizations do need to be, yes, they need to have processes in place that enable them to react more quickly to things that are changing on a day-to-day basis, but they also need to be preparing for the things that are coming in the future. I think there's one other thing that I'd like to add as well, in that, yes, we're getting all this information, whether it's internally or externally, and we're able to make informed decisions around what to do about those things and put controls in place to either prevent them from happening or limit the damage or whatever it might be. But I think also organizations need to be in a position to determine whether those controls are effective. At the moment, lots of organizations are still doing the annual audit approach in a similar way to what they do an annual or a 6-monthly risk assessment. And that's fine, but it's a snapshot in time. And those controls might be effective now, but how effective are they on a continual basis? Can we look back over the last 12 months and be convinced that those controls have never failed, that they're always operating at peak efficiency, that we're always getting the level of protection that we see when we do the snapshot audits? So I think moving towards more of an evidence-based assurance model where we monitor and measure those controls and the controls' effectiveness on a continual basis, and learning from the outputs of those, I think is really important, so we can make continual adjustments, especially in the light of the fact that things are changing, as Chris said. And so our controls might be effective now, but they might not be effective next week because something's changed.
Yeah. And I think we also need to remember that this isn't all one way. The way we've been talking about this so far is it sort of feels like that the poor risk process is sitting there being bombarded by all of these challenges, by the greater rate of change, by these new technologies and everything. It's almost certain, it's certain that over the next few years, the tools available for risk management will in themselves develop. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know whether you, Wayne, have seen any major evolution in the risk management tool sets over the last couple of years. They have tended to stay.
Yeah. I think essentially the principles of risk management have remained the same, haven't they? So it's just an evolution of the same thing. The tools might get smarter, etc. I think one thing that might become part of it is sort of related to some of the subjects that we've been talking about today, the use of AI and technology and the way that those tools can evolve and incorporate AI in order for it to your previous point, respond quicker, make decisions for us, or even if if we don't want it to make decisions for us, at least it can alert us to certain things so that we can take action.
Yeah, and thinking about it, it's slightly surprising what we haven't seen. Certainly, I haven't seen anything in along those lines so far. You would imagine almost certainly that there will be an evolution of the tools, which exactly as you say, give the ability to assess a wider range of outcomes in a quicker way, so that you can look at particular scenarios and extrapolate out what the different levels of risk are associated with them, and moving away from the quite manual process that we've got currently. So I think that risk advisors will need to be open to the changes in technology and how those can actually be utilised to enable risk management to handle the challenges that we've been talking about.
Thank you so much for your time today, guys. If any of our listeners would like to ask Chris and Wayne a question, there's going to be a link in the description to this episode, which will take you to a form on our website. or you can just pop your question in the comments. So thank you again for chatting to me today, guys. Thank you everyone for listening today, and we will see you next time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.